Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ISM discussion panel about COVID-19 and its impact on gender, race and disability on those who are working in the music industry. My name is Vick Bain. I'm a board council member of the ISM. I've been a member of the ISM for a number of years now as a professional working in the music industry. But I'm also a music industry consultant on diversity in music and a PhD researcher looking at women's careers in the music industry. So the panel that we've got today is of real personal interest and professional interest to me. I also want to just say as well before we meet everyone, can all of the viewers out there, can you please ask your questions using Slido? And I've also been asked to say that if you are on social media, if you can use the hashtag empowered musician to talk about this panel as well. So I want to give a huge welcome to an amazing panel we have this afternoon, all with a particular professional interest in what we're going to talk about. And I'll just give a very brief introduction to them all, and then they can introduce themselves properly after that. So first of all, we have Mary Alice Stack, Chief Executive of Creative United. They've recently published or co-published a report called Reshape Music, which is exploring the lived experience of disabled musicians in education. And Keith Harris, OBE, Head of Promotions and then General Manager of Motown Records at EMI, Operations Manager for Stevie Wonder, Chairman of the Music Managers Forum and the Equality and Diversity Task Force for UK Music. Mahaliah Edwards, a successful career as a violinist, educator, community music facilitator and advocate for music for social change. And finally, Mark Taylor, a senior lecturer in quantitative methods in sociology at the University of Sheffield, his research focus being inequalities in culture. So what an incredible panel. I can't wait to talk to you, but if we'd like to go around, you can give us some more information than the little headline that I gave there. And yes, I guess if we start with Mary Alice. Can we find out more about your personal and professional experiences in the creative industries?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so as you mentioned in the brief intro, I'm the chief executive of a company called Creative United, which is a community interest company with a focus on supporting arts and creative industries to develop and grow and to help them maximise their social impact within the communities that they're based. Our involvement in the music sector really is principally driven through a scheme called Take It Away, which was originally developed and launched at the Arts Council of England as an initiative to try and reduce financial barriers to participation in music through the provision of interest-free loans. So right at the beginning, my journey in the kind of music industry was to try and understand kind of social inequalities in terms of economic barriers. You know, what does participation in music mean if you don't have the money to equip yourself with the right instruments to play and develop as a musician? So social and economic considerations around access to music was my starting point. I'm not a musician myself, although I did learn to play the flute when I was a child, but my professional involvement in the industry has really been looking at the kind of mechanisms for increasing financial inclusion and participation in the music sector. And in the last few years, that focus has pivoted slightly to be more directly looking at a combination of financial and other barriers that exist for disabled musicians. So where the instrument itself may be a physical barrier to participation in music, if you don't have the use of two hands, two arms, in what other ways might you develop as a musician and play a traditional musical instrument if the kind of technical capabilities of playing it in its conventional form are not open to you? So I've had the most fascinating journey really in beginning to understand what those barriers really mean in practice for a huge range of people who have different forms of disabilities, and a real passion, desire and talent for music. So how do those barriers present themselves, and what can we do as an industry and as a society to allow those barriers to recede into the background and to not be present, and to allow as many people as possible to have a full opportunity to participate in music and to develop professional careers in music too?
I think you've launched right in and raised some really important points that we're certainly going to come back to. Both with economic and physical barriers. And we'll return to those certainly with a prism through COVID-19 as well. What additional impact has that had? Thank you. Now, Keith, you've had an absolutely fantastic career, and I always love hearing about it. But if you want to share with the ISM audience a bit about your personal journey.
Right. First of all, I'm always very reluctant when people describe what I've had as a career, because a career always feels to me like something that has a bit of a plan and a structure. And in fact, I have entered into the music industry because I just happened to be absolutely fascinated by particularly pop music, and always wanted to work in it, and was fortunate enough to find myself in there, and then stumbled from one lucky accident to another as I kind of went through my working life. So I would describe myself these days as a music business has-been. Most of the things that you describe me as doing in the introduction are things that I have done, but I no longer do. With the exception of I still do work with Stevie Wonder after however many 42 years. But for the most part, most of the things that were mentioned were things that I have done. And what's happened really in this particular context, the one that we're talking about today, is that I was kind of catapulted forward in the whole debate about diversity in the music industry, which is something which I've obviously been aware of and worked behind the scenes towards achieving, for really throughout my career, because there have been very many obstacles and barriers that have been put in my way, as there would be with any other black person in British society, if you like, over the last 45, 50 years. But I was catapulted forward in this because my children persuaded me to write something for something that was called Blackout Tuesday about 9 months ago, the other day when everybody shut down their social media. And I was asked by initially my oldest son, who is also an artist manager, whether I wouldn't write something about the situation with racism in the record industry and so on and so forth. Something which I've kind of spoken about behind the scenes, but have never really been prominent in saying a lot about openly. I've rather tried to get on to do something about it rather than just talk about it. And at the time that he asked me if I would write something, my initial reaction was, I was really quite hesitant, on the basis that I felt that it would seem a little bit self-serving on the back of the serious events that had brought it about, particularly obviously the death of George Floyd and so on and so forth. For me to be writing about my particular journey in a way sounded a little bit, or felt like it might be a little bit trivial. But then what persuaded me was that actually one of my other sons was around here at the time, and he basically said to me, come on, Dad, you're nearly 70. You've been in the industry for such a long time and through so many things. If you don't say something, who is going to? And I thought, you make a good point there. I actually have a responsibility to start to speak out about some of my personal experience, because it's relevant to what's happening to people now. And so I wrote an open letter to the captains of the music industry about a little bit about my experience, but more poignantly about how important it was that the lessons that have been learned in the last 6 to 9 months were not temporary, that they had to basically be learned and carried forward for the years to come and for the generations to come. People like me, I've been actually very fortunate, and I've had a life in the music industry which, you know, I certainly can't complain about. But it doesn't mean that I've been immune to some of the things that other people are going through. And I wanted to say something about that in the hope of making other younger Black British people in the industry aware that it is something that we've all basically faced, and we all need to continue to strive to get proper equality so that in future people don't have those barriers coming into the industry.
Thank you, Keith. And do you get the impression that your letter has you know, is actually going to impact some meaningful change rather than just lip service?
Well, what happened was, again, I am unusual in several ways, but one of the most unusual things is I have no social media presence whatsoever. So I don't have Facebook, Instagram, you know, nothing. And so what happened is that I'm obviously aware of social media and its impact, but what I hadn't figured out was the impact of being able to write this letter, which I then sent to several music industry trade papers, you know, because I knew the people who ran the papers. So I knew Mark Sutherland at Music Week and Tink Ingham at Music Business Worldwide and Paul Scaife at Record of the Day, who were the three people I sent the letter to. And of course, you know, well, say, of course, they then published the letter very kindly. But what I didn't anticipate was that Billboard magazine would then tweet it out to its 6 million followers. Yeah. So, you know, it actually made a much bigger impact than I originally anticipated. And more importantly, because it wasn't about me or my letter, more importantly, it seemed to be a bit of a catalyst for a lot of people also to come forward and put forward their personal experiences. And these things then snowball, you know, and so I think it is having an ongoing effect.
Mm.
And the important thing is it is carried on until next year and beyond.
Mm. Yeah, I really sense a sea change out there across the industry. But you know, fingers crossed that we do have some meaningful change. So Mahaliah, and you know, I'd like to know more about your journey and yeah.
Hi everyone. Hi. So I'm Mahaliah Edwards. I am a violinist and a recent graduate from the Royal Bain Conservatoire. And aside from performing, I'm really interested and dedicated really in ensuring that everybody, every child, every young person has high quality access to high quality music education. And I've spent the last few years working with initiatives such as Systema Europe. I worked with London Music Masters, now Music Masters, and I'm currently a music teacher, whole class education at the Nottingham Music Hub. And Nottingham is one of, you know, the most deprived cities in the country, but I think, you know, we do a really good job in providing access to lots of children around the city who through, you know, socioeconomic circumstances or cultural values, they wouldn't have access to high quality music education. So it's really something that is really quite close to my heart, because being somebody who is quite a rarity in the classical music industry, being Black, being a young Black female, I think it's really well, it just became apparent that they're, you know, why am I the only one? I've been to conservatoire, I've done all of these things. I went to Purcell School before that, and even in a very highly specialised area, the higher up you go with achievements, the smaller the bubble becomes and the less diverse it seems to be. So my kind of life's dedication really is to kind of ensure that this changes. And for me, that lies in, like I say, access to education, high quality education. It's not just about being, you know, is that equality versus equity? Yes, some people are getting an education, most children are getting an education, but what kind of education are they getting that will put them on a level playing field with their future peers at conservatoire? Or even if they're not aiming to be a professional musician, how can they still have lots of tools in their toolkit that can enable them to achieve just as much as the next kid who doesn't struggle economically or whose family might value music in a different way to their own. So yeah, that's kind of, it's a big part of where I see my career going. Obviously, I'm still quite young. I've only graduated a year ago, but I think it's really important work. And I think a lot of professional musicians, virtuosi, maybe orchestral players, they see outreach and education as a sideline or something that isn't necessarily the most rewarding or the most viable. But I think instead of it being something that I just do to kind of tick a box, I think it really is integral to changing the music profession from the inside out. And I'm not just talking about classical music, even though we do have a big problem with diversity. I mean the whole music profession, the whole music industry. I think there needs to be a lot more variation, and that can be in the forms of the composers or the artists that we listen to, that we promote, but also, you know, who's on the panels of audition, who's teaching at the conservatoires. You know, I spent 4 years in a conservatoire where the most Black people I saw were cleaners. That sends out a subliminal message that I don't belong there. Not that I ever thought I did, but I'm thinking of the children that are coming up in the future generations. What message are we sending out? So through music making, but also mentoring, and I'm now trustee for Awards for Young Musician. They're a great charity that actually support young musicians with, you know, really great grants and opportunities to kind of further their musical journeys. So yeah, I've recently become a trustee for them, and they actually helped me out. I was an alumni when just after I joined the Purcell School. They gave me money towards a new violin, and that kind of changed the game for me. So I'm really passionate about giving back and making sure that the changes that we want to see are being actioned, not just talked about in a statement to say that, you know, we're standing in solidarity, but actual actions and mentoring and opportunities for young people in particular.
Wow, that sounds like really amazing work that I'm sure is going to start to make an impact. But could you say the name of that charity again? Sorry, I missed that.
Awards for Young Musicians. They're based, well, there isn't actually one office, there are loads of people, but it's a small team that are based in London, I believe, and they give grants, they give opportunities, arrange masterclasses in lockdown for gifted young children who need an opportunity. They say that talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not, and I think that's a great tagline that rings so true. And especially with the pandemic, the opportunities have kind of dwindled.
That's that's certainly true. And I know, Mark, this is in your research area. Could you tell us a bit about your career and academic work in this area?
Yeah, thanks very much, Vic. So my name's Mark. I'm based at the University of Sheffield, and I'm not a musician. I don't work in the music industry, and I never have. I think the reason why I'm part of this conversation is that I have been researching questions around what you might call inequalities in cultural and creative work for quite a long time now. And so a lot of the work that I do is quite macro in its approach. So, you know, you'll notice that I said culture and creative industries rather than music in particular. And, you know, some of the work that I do involves sort of like quite large scale quantitative work about things like the makeup of different occupational sectors. And these introductions have been great because I think a lot of what people have been talking about has really fed into some of the things that me and colleagues have been trying to understand ourselves. So to give a little bit of context, I have recently, with Orion Brooke and Dave O'Brien, published a book called Culture is Bad for You, Inequalities in the Cultural and Creative Industries, which was originally going to come out in May. And when we got to March, we realised that a lot of the patterns that we were talking about, some of the inequalities that we were describing, were things that the response to the pandemic was only going to make worse in a lot of different ways. And so some of the things that we talk about include sort of like quite macro level inequalities, things like the dominance of white people, people from middle class backgrounds and so on, working in these kinds of jobs, but also consistent with what Mahaliah has been describing, how these sorts of inequalities get more pronounced as you go up the pole, if you like, as people get more senior, as people get further into their careers. And there's a number of ways through which these inequalities manifest themselves. Some of them are sort of obviously financial in their focus, you know, people's abilities to work for nothing or work for sort of risibly low pay. If you have significant money behind you, then working for free for a couple of years might be viable in a way that if you have to pay your own rent and cover your own expenses, it wouldn't be. But it's not just about money. It's also, we saw quite pronounced patterns around parenting, the number of women who were getting squeezed out of work. I mean, actually, whether they were having children or not, the expectation in a number of sectors that, you know, as women working in creative work, you'd have a nice time in your 20s, but really by your 30s, you should be doing something else, which was a set of expectations that we didn't see for the men that we were working with. But also, when we think about social class, for example, it's not just about money. Some of the people that we were talking to, some of the people that we interviewed who were telling us about how, for example, people that they had been at college with, people that they've been at conservatoires with, you know, they would have a dad whose friend was an agent, or they would have a dad who would know somebody who could maybe hook them up with an internship for a month or so where they'd be able to get great contacts. And so the pandemic will potentially only make this worse. You know, if the current patterns, and I can talk a little bit about the numbers on this in a minute, are indicating that, you know, the financial support that's currently being offered really isn't sufficient, particularly for musicians. A number of musicians are falling through the cracks, which are, you know, in the government's current support strategy for workers, and in many ways those people who are being supported by that, that's nonetheless insufficient. If you are the kind of person who can afford to work for nothing for a year, you're more likely to still be doing the work in a year's, 2 years, 5 years time. And so this is going to have major implications for the makeup of the music industry in a post-pandemic society.
Very, very serious, I think, consequences that we all need to keep an eye on. But you know, does anyone have any thoughts about you know, what we can be doing to address some of these barriers? I mean, Mahaliah, you talked about the charity work that you are doing. You know, have you seen this year? You know, you were saying the impact of young people being able to access music education. How are they accessing music education right now when everyone's in lockdown?
Well, simply, if those who have the means to pay for online lessons, or those who have the means to have opportunities, access opportunities online, if they have the equipment to access those opportunities online, are accessing them. In my work with the Nottingham Music Hub, we have a problem where we were sharing instruments because we didn't have enough instruments at certain schools. Not every child had their own instrument. We provide the instrument for free. The children use it at school in their lessons. However, with the pandemic, no one wants to share instruments, and that was a decision that our board felt needed to be taken. And that means that many of our children across Nottingham City schools aren't having their usual music lessons with their instruments. So we've, you know, thought outside the box, devised a non-instrument curriculum, a scheme of work that we do. However, it's still not the same as learning on their instrument. And sure, we can say, well, you can buy your own instrument and then take part in music lessons, but that's not inclusive. And, you know, we've applied for grants and things like that to kind of make sure that everybody has the chance. But yeah, that's just an example of how we've gone from having a provision where everybody has a musical instrument, everybody takes the time to learn in an inclusive way. And now because of the pandemic, that's kind of stripped back a lot of what we do and how we do it. So those who can, a lot of our online provision has been really successful, but again, not everybody has a electronic device to even access that. Not everybody has supportive parents who value what we do and what benefits that passes on to their children. Because even though the children themselves are the beneficiaries, the parents are the people who are kind of buying or subscribing to the product of music lessons. So that question of value as well, and whether that ties in culturally, you know, a lot of people have religious reasons why they don't want to participate and whatever. So that's really kind of thrown a spanner in the works for a lot of what we do, but we've had to think outside the box and really creatively how we can, you know, retain enthusiasm from the schools, from the parents, and from the pupils themselves during the pandemic.
And of course, it's going to affect group lessons as well. I mean, I understand there's some sort of technical issues with getting people to play and perform music all at the same time over such things as Zoom. So have you been able to do any of that, or is it just yeah?
Yes, since March actually. We run the Robin Hood Youth Orchestra in Nottingham, and we've been doing online rehearsals over Microsoft Teams since March. And it kind of works where one person, like I'm speaking now, I would play, everyone else is muted. So there's not a sense of communal playing because you can only hear yourself, but you can see other people playing, and you can see your desk partner playing with you, and then people can unmute themselves if they're feeling confident to play by themselves. And yeah, that's how we've been keeping the kind of communal spirit of orchestral playing and group playing alive, and so that children and young people don't feel isolated. And actually for some people it's worked a lot better because they can come out their shell, they're in the comfort of their own homes making music. So yes, the pandemic has exacerbated some of these issues and completely made it worse, but in other ways it's enabled us to think creatively. Okay, in the future we know that should anything happen, or we can try this way to improve what we do, as well as have a solution for a problem. It's actually helping things to be improved in lots of different ways.
I think with all crises, sometimes we see the worst, but sometimes we see the best of people as well. So that sounds like wonderful work. And Mary Alice, I know that some of the things that Mahaliah talked about, you would resonate with you and your work. Do you want to talk about what Creative United has been doing this year?
Yeah, I mean, funnily enough, a lot of the work we've been doing in the last year has been in partnership with the Nottingham Music Hub, and it's so great to meet Mahaliah and to hear about your direct experience as one of the teaching staff involved with the hub, because that's really been a very pioneering project. So what we were doing with Nottingham starting last year, 2019, and continuing in the current year was to conduct an audit of the children in primary schools who were coming into year 4 when whole class ensemble teaching would take place, to understand if there were any children who had a physical disability that might prevent them from participating alongside their peers. And prior to that pilot project starting, the team at Nottingham, who've been so fantastic, they said, well, as far as we know, that there aren't any disabled children. Those children haven't been presented to us for support, so maybe there aren't any there. And statistically, we knew that was very unlikely, because the statistics show that 1 in 5 people have a disability, and we knew from the local authority data that there were thousands of children in Nottingham City who were on a list of children with physical disabilities and had support provision in place through SEND or other provision. So we knew that they existed, but we didn't know was why they weren't showing up in music classes, why the teaching staff in the hub were unaware of them. And partly this is all to do with information exchange. Unless you can ask the question at the appropriate time, do you have any children who've got any additional needs? You can't prepare to meet those needs. You can't prepare to make the appropriate adjustments to ensure that their experience is as inclusive and fulfilling as possible. And that experience of inclusivity is there for every child, no matter what their playing ability is or whatever impairment they may have to contend with. So asking the question at the right time was really, that was the essence of the intervention, is to say to the schools, please tell us, are there any children who might need a bit of extra help or an adaptive instrument or a bit of assistive equipment? Because if they do have that need, we can provide those instruments, assistive equipment, and think creatively about the solutions. But we've got to have a little window of opportunity in which to make that happen. Otherwise, you get to your first class, you get to bringing everyone into the room, and what is the choice of instrument? In Mahaliah's case, it's probably strings, but in other schools, they may be playing recorder, clarinet, trumpet, trombone. So the choice of instrument is different in different schools. And if there are children in that class who can't physically accommodate that instrument in exactly the same way as everyone else, then what happens? Then are they told to leave or given something different to play, which immediately sets them apart, immediately makes them feel different, excluded? They can't learn in the same way because they're on a different instrument. So this whole kind of principle of whole class, which is good in a sense, is because it sounds inclusive, doesn't it? Whole class sounds very inclusive, but in practice, unless you're able to understand and identify difference that exists within that whole class in good time, and unless the teaching staff are aware of what accommodations can be made, what adjustments can be introduced to make that a more equal experience and opportunity, then unfortunately the result is that those children are not part of whole class at all. They are absolutely not getting a parity of educational offer, and this is it's a problem right across music education, is that there is not enough awareness and understanding of adaptive instruments, of assistive equipment, of the ways in which we can adapt music learning around the needs of the individual child, rather than saying it's whole class and it's going to be like this. You know, that is not a terribly flexible and inclusive way of conceptually delivering music education. And so, although I say these things, you know, with confidence and commitment to making change, I also recognise just how difficult that is. And so the work that we're doing, and the Reshape Music report, which you mentioned at the beginning, Vic, which was published jointly with Youth Music and was based on research that we did in 2018 to try and understand exactly what these barriers look like for disabled musicians or disabled children, and what is their direct experience, their lived experience, and what is their desire and ambition in music, and how can we try and align those two better. It won't happen overnight, but information exchange is so critical, and allowing the people who are most affected by these problems to guide the thinking and inform the solutions is also absolutely critical. And if anyone hasn't read the Reshape Music report, it's not a long read, but it's such an informative read. I'd really, really recommend it to everyone. It's published on the Youth Music website, and it gives you a sense of that lived experience of disability and how it's impacting on lots of different music learning and performance experiences. And the work that we're continuing to do in Nottingham, what we're hoping is that based on that experience with the team in Nottingham City, we can begin building this approach, this intervention as an example of best practice. We can begin extending that learning across other music hubs. And then we arrive at a point, hopefully not in the too distant future, where the notion of whole class is finessed to understand how to be more sensitive to difference, as well as delivering something that is for everyone in that sense of the whole class.
So that's you know, so really I think thorough, you know, explanation of what some of the barriers can be in music education for the younger children wanting to learn instruments and start on their music journey. But I'm also interested in some of the barriers to entry for the professional music industry. And Keith, I wonder if you have anything to say about that, and about, you know, what you view as contemporary barriers to the people wanting to enter the UK music industry in your experience.
What I think that Mark actually made some really good points, which are really relevant here. because obviously the discussion we're talking about today is music in the COVID world. I'm actually much more interested in what's going to happen in the post-COVID world. In what's over the last 6 to 9 months, everybody suffered. It's one of those unusual situations where I don't believe that from a music and a music business point of view, that being an ethnic minority has been a particular disadvantage. It's been terrible for everybody. It's basically what I'm saying about that. But one of the points that Mark made, which I think is a really important one, is that a lot of the way that the music industry operates, both for professional musicians, but also for educators, for music business people, is that you are as good as your social network, right? And particularly, you're as good as your parents' social network. And this is the thing that I thought that Mark raised, which is really interesting. A lot of employment in the industry has traditionally come through knowing somebody who knows somebody who can advise you or point you in the right direction. Now, what I think will happen is over the last 9 months, so many people who are economically disadvantaged have had to drop out of even any aspiration of being involved in music, because obviously there's never been a great deal of money around for most musicians, but money has kind of dropped off a cliff for most live musicians for the last 6 to 9 months. And those particularly who are already economically disadvantaged will disappear altogether from the landscape. And that is going to have a knock-on effect for their children who are also trying to get into the industry. Because even those tenuous and tentative connections that they already had are going to disappear. And I fear that it's going to be a lot more difficult for people to have any kind of entry point into the industry. I think that as a Black industry professional over the years, it has all surprised me how many people have kind of reached out to me, not because I had any particular connection with them, but they just see another ethnic minority face in the industry who might be a starting point for them to get on the ladder. And I've always felt, obviously, it's part of my responsibility to help where I can. Now, the point is that I think that over the last 6 to 9 months, although there's been massive progress, and I mean actually in some areas, pretty massive progress in terms of improving the diversity of the workforce in the music industry. There is going to be a significant step backwards in terms of people getting that initial point of access just because they can't afford it. I think that, again, Mark made some very, very good points on that subject, which is that only people who can afford to work for nothing for a significant amount of time can cling on there to get to that next step. And that's really my fear and my concern, is I'm not sure how we're going to address the leveling up of financial opportunity in the post-COVID world to make sure that people who are already economically disadvantaged can actually get a foothold in the industry.
I wonder if, Mark, if you've got any thoughts about that. I think I understand it's often referred to as cultural capital, this sort of network in your family background, but it's very closely aligned with economic capital as well. Have you got any thoughts about how we as a music industry can be aware of this and try to help people who maybe haven't got these backgrounds?
I think it's really tricky. I mean, one distinction that I would make that I think is maybe important is, I don't know, I'm maybe less concerned about barriers to entry as I am barriers to retention, because, music is not like getting a job working in consultancy or working in finance or whatever, where getting the first job is the hard part and then you're in. Like a lot of people might have had a single piece of work in the music industry, which might have gone okay, but then going from that first piece of work into something like, a stable revenue source where this is definitely something that people can do, is much more of a challenge in music, I think, than it is in other lines of work. And that's worth, I think, flagging fairly explicitly, because there's a danger where we think, oh, okay, well, this person has had some work, you know, they've had a paid gig, okay, they're a success, we can start thinking about the next person. And one of the, you know, like looking at creative work, the diversity of people doing their first job is often not too bad. And so, but there's a danger in thinking, okay, well, this new generation coming in seems to be really diverse, this is really encouraging. What's going to happen is we just need to wait 10 years and they'll be in mid-career and sort of more established roles. And we know that doesn't happen. We know that the sort of the attrition, what people sometimes refer to as a leaky pipeline, is really pronounced. And so while I think a lot of the mechanisms are quite similar, we should maybe be more explicit in our concerns about retention as opposed to barriers to entry. But in terms of your question about how the music industry can be more alert to more sort of like slightly softer cultural barriers, it's difficult because being aware of them isn't the same as being able to do anything about it. You know, like if somebody has, you know, if somebody started having lessons when they were very young, and then they maybe through personal networks, through social capital, their parents' contacts, were able to get auditions and they were able to, you know, like perform in ensembles, you know, that experience will have been beneficial. In their case, it's not just that, you know, the networks meant that they knew somebody that knew somebody. It meant that they will then find it easier to drop into professional contexts. There's loads of good stuff going on. You know, on top of the schemes that have already been discussed, I'd point people towards Arts Emergency, who are a tremendous charity who work nationally, where young people who are interested in working in creative industries, they've got a lot of people working in music, are paired up with mentors. It's what they call the Alternative Old Boys Network, which I think is an amazing title that really summarizes how things work and, you know, the underlying inequalities and how they can maybe be challenged. But it's, you know, like we can't change things overnight. There needs to be a sort of sense of realism, and equally there needs to be an acknowledgement that music can't maybe challenge a lot of these inequalities on its own. You know, these social systems that reproduce themselves in a lot of the ways that we've been discussing can be seen in other occupational sectors, in other bits of cultural and creative industries. And so, like, I don't want to be too negative, but people often ask me, you know, I've sort of described these problems and people tell me, you know, what's the solution? It's like, well, it's, none of this will change overnight. And, you know, you don't want to get political necessarily, but having another diversity panel and having inequality, diversity and inclusion working group in your place of work will not overturn these inequalities overnight.
But it's I think, you know, it's better than where we were 10 years ago. I know Keith, when you helped establish and chair the UK Music Diversity Task Force, you know, when was that, 8-10 years ago? I mean, you know, there was no data, there was no research, there was not even an acknowledgement. In fact, I think there was a lot of denial that there was a problem in the music industry.
Yeah, it wasn't even as long ago as that. I think it was only about 5 or 6 years ago that we first started the Diversity Task Force. And yes, the starting point was trying to get some data, because there's so much anecdotal evidence, but very little concrete data. And as you rightly point out, many people were in denial. They said, well, you know, I can't see there's a problem. And that was the overall reaction from the industry. And I think that when we started the task force, we actually started with two things in mind. One thing was that in order to give a sense that it's not all hopeless, you generally need a few quick wins, a few things that actually happen, that people actually can see significant change. And I was very fortunate at the time to be helped by a gentleman who's the chairman of the BPI, British Phonographic Industries, Jed Doherty, who at the time decided that he was going to completely revamp the Brits Awards panel, because the Brits Awards had really kind of fallen into disrepute, because the artists that were being chosen had lost the relevance to the contemporary forms of popular music. And so Jed completely revamped the Brits Awards panel, and that was a very high profile thing, and the press wrote about it and so on and so forth. So that was kind of on the quick win side. But for me, what was much more important was the longer, more structural change, and that takes a lot longer time, and people have to be a lot more committed to it. And I think that obviously it got a massive shot in the arm this year because of Black Lives Matter, but I do start to get the sense that a lot of the change is irreversible, which is pretty important. Because what I usually say about this whole debate is it's a bit like watching your children grow. You sit there and they're in the house and they're out, and then all of a sudden, they're bigger than you, and they're leaving, and you actually haven't noticed the progress. But I talk a little bit about say my tale, and one of the things I quite often tell people is that in the first 18 months working in the music industry, I drove nearly 90,000 miles on UK roads, going around radio stations plugging records. And people say, wow, that's but then when I tell them the reason why I drove 90,000 miles, it puts things in context and makes people realize that actually some progress has been made. I think it's quite important that people actually get the sense that some progress is being made, otherwise people think it's hopeless. The reason why I drove the 90,000 miles is because the first record company I worked for, which is called Transatlantic Records, you mentioned in the introduction, was a very small independent label without a great deal of resource. And as a result, at the end of the day, instead of like my colleagues in the bigger record companies, at the end of my working day, instead of going to a hotel and spending the night in a hotel, they could only afford to give me the money to get a bed and breakfast. And in the early 70s, it wasn't easy for a black person to get a bed and breakfast in cities outside of London. So for the first couple of weeks, I would finish my day's work and try and get a bed and breakfast. And I got so sick of being humiliated by the fact that the vacancy signs came down and blatant vacancy signs were up, and people were telling me, actually, no, we haven't got any rooms, that I decided after about a week that I would just drive home. Didn't matter where I was. So if I finished in Manchester, I'd drive home to London. If I finished in Nottingham, I'd drive home to London, because I wasn't prepared to put myself through the humiliation of being turned down for a room at the end of the day. Now, that was when I started in the music industry. Now, when I tell people that story, people, especially a lot of young people, are totally incredulous. They cannot believe that it was legal for people to do that. But it was when I started in the industry. So some progress has been made. So the sense of hopelessness is really an important thing to get over, and realize that incremental change actually leads to significant change over a period of time.
Wow, well, that's a story I hadn't heard before, Keith, and that's very sobering, I think, reminder. And I'm pleased we do not live in the early 1970s now. So, for me, I think one of the great things about the diversity task force is that it is tracking data, and it is tracking some progress, and what we're seeing, as Mark points out, is that actually if you look at those who are in their 20s working in the music industry, actually it's majority female now. There are more women who are working in the executive jobs. I'm not talking about as musicians. So it is that retention, I think, in the workforce, and certainly with my own research, I have found the situation is still not very good for female musicians. although in the classical music genre, it's better than some of the others. So, right, for the last sort of 20 minutes or so, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that have been coming in, and then I'll put the questions to the appropriate person or whoever wants to jump in. So yes, a question from Paul Barton Hodges. What about parenting? COVID-19 has been tough on people trying to continue working in music, but also parents and carers, and I absolutely agree with that, with my parent hat on. So Keith, you've mentioned you've got kids, but maybe they're grown up now. Has anybody got anything to say about the impact of COVID on parents working in music? Nobody got any. Well, I'm also a board trustee of a charity called Parents and Carers in Performing Arts, and they are just about to do some research next year looking at parents in music. So if anybody is interested in that, they can look at pippacampaign.com, and you know, because it's for sure. I think there are some real barriers being raised there. Yeah. And another question is, how can we tackle inequality in performance? Key Change are doing great work around making festival lineups more diverse. So is anybody, maybe Mahaliah, you've got some thoughts about how do we tackle inequality in performance? You are a violinist. You know, what do you think about that?
I think it will take incremental change, but there are a few kind of basic baseline things that people can do, which are looking at your concert program. What's going on there? Do you have the same great composers, but they're the composers of the canon be constantly here? If you have a look at, you know, concert programs, especially in classical music, they're usually taken from the same literature, the same repertoire. They are very, very narrow in terms of what we put out there. So yeah, just adding in new composers, different performers as well, and that it's diversity within performance is not something that's specific to one area. It's an effort that is going to come from every single facet of the industry. So it's about publishers publishing music from diverse people of diverse backgrounds, more female composers, people who, you know, haven't had a great representation in the output. It's about, you know, agencies taking on, you know, different types of people. It's about musicians themselves going outside of their circles. You know, I'd absolutely love to get involved with an orchestra that has, you know, people who aren't able-bodied like myself, and see how that works, and see, you know, how that can be a positive force for change in the output. It's an effort that has to come from all areas, from the basics of education. I'm literally the only Black person that I think some of my students have ever seen play an instrument in real life. I'm talking about like an actual tangible role model. So it's about education. It's about when we progress. It's about people who are publishing music, people who are representing artists. It's about artists themselves. It's got to be an effort from all areas. And I think it's one thing for organisations, like I said earlier, to put out a statement to say you're standing in solidarity. It's another thing to kind of action the things that you talk about. And I think someone put a question saying they've seen somebody being sort of bullied or ridiculed. And I think if you're not feeling confident to go and, you know, assert yourself in that situation, maybe it's inappropriate. I think the organisation or the charity or the ensemble, it needs to come right from the top that that's unacceptable, and do something about that. As I say, just putting out an action, putting out a statement is not the same as actually having action. And if the people at the top are enforcing that and making sure that is a real thing that they're doing, then it will trickle down as well.
I think that it's absolutely has mirrored my personal experiences. I've worked in various parts of music for 25 years, and did my research as well. it all keeps coming down to the leadership, the leaders of the organizations. They set the tone, they set the culture, they have the power and authority to be able to enforce change on their organizations, and maybe remove those who aren't in living up to those ideals and values. And
and it needs to start at home. It needs to start at home. Don't leave it to somebody else, because you think, oh, but that's not really my bag, or oh, I'm not really someone who's represented. It's amazing to see Mary Alice say, I'm not a musician, I am able-bodied, but I'm still putting in the work, and I think that's the kind of stance that everybody needs to take. It shouldn't have to affect you directly for you to try and make a change, and it's contagious, so start now.
Great point. And Mary Alice, do you have thoughts about that? How can we tackle inequality in performance?
Yeah, I mean, I was wanted to go back to something Keith said right at the beginning, actually, about the impact of COVID and how it's affected everyone. And because it's affected everyone, I think it's created a unique opportunity in terms of the timing is right for change. So no better opportunity appears to have ever presented itself in my lifetime for systemic change, because it's been the great leveler, COVID. It's put everyone in a position of discomfort, and it's put everyone in a position of having to adjust and having for a moment to understand what it means to not be able to travel, to not be physically able to travel, or not have the means, the financial means to get from A to B. We've suddenly all found ourselves in a unifying position to some extent. That there's still winners and losers under COVID as well. I'm not ignoring that, but in the sense of everyone's experience of having to suddenly step off the kind of hamster wheel and reflect and consider and listen to those arguments about structural inequality, listen to the arguments about how we're so used to doing things in a particular way that it becomes incredibly difficult to actually implement change. Well, now is the moment, if ever there was a moment to implement change and to kind of start again and say, okay, let's just take a moment to think how we can make this better. Building back better is a sort of theme that our company is very focused on at the moment, particularly looking at the fate of creative freelancers over this past 9-10 months. The people who've fallen through the gaps. These are things that actually we can learn from and improve structurally the way that our society works, how people's portfolio careers are understood by policymakers, by government, how we can put safety nets in place, allow people who have caring responsibilities, parenting responsibilities, physical disabilities that mean that the cost of living is far greater for them because of their disability. How do we create a more equal playing field for everyone? And so I'm actually, we're still in the depths of this crisis, but I'm actually quite hopeful that this post-COVID world could really be changed for the better. And I think the work that organisations like Attitude is Everything is doing around accessibility for performance venues is great. I want to also pay credit to the work that is being done by the campaigning group We Shall Not Be Removed. There are a huge number of professionals there in the music industry, in the other parts of the creative sector, who've established really strong careers. And the risk to our sector right now is that because of COVID, venues and organisations become far more risk averse, unnecessarily so, because they're trying to do the thing that's easiest in terms of reopening, but they need to absolutely consider the needs of the individuals and how the right kind of adjustments to take into account the needs of those musicians who may have additional shielding needs at this time for health risks, who may have other access needs. We should just be embedding as far as we can right now the consideration of individual circumstances when we roll out policy, when we roll out our reopening strategies as we re-enter the kind of post-COVID world where hopefully social interaction, shared experience of performance, either as the performer yourself or as an audience member, those things come back in, is we should be a far more respectful, inclusive, diverse and empathetic society. I hope that's maybe maybe I'm a dreamer, as they say, but I think that this experience has been so fundamental for me. It has, I'm sure, for many other people watching. It's been a very challenging time, but I've learned so much. And I feel like I am going to come out the other side of this better for it, and I hope that will be the case for lots and lots of businesses.
I really hope you're right. Sorry, Keith.
So can I just jump in and endorse what Mary Alice is saying there, but particularly with the emphasis on how we have an opportunity to reset. And I'm going to refer back to the first question that somebody asked about parenting and its effect on obviously the work of musicians and so on and so forth. And I would like to see more value placed on the extended family. Because when people talk about parenting these days, it's very linear. It's either the husband or the wife, but they don't think then about grandparents and aunts and uncles. And actually, I think that one of the effects of COVID has been partly because people have been keeping in touch with wider family circles and so on and so forth, that people actually start to realize that actually the caring for children and young people can be extended to a wider range of people, but government policy needs to enable that and needs to enable a recognition of that, and not just for children but for other caring needs. To actually extending that family circle would be a very good way forward in terms of making the maximum use of the resource we have in society.
Gosh, I think that's a really excellent point. I come from a very huge Northeast Geordie family, and that's that's been very much part of my background. And I think we forget that, and you're right. It's certainly forgotten in government policies. We've got these natural communities to help each other already. I've also got quite an interesting question here, and I think to me, I think it's all about being one of the phrases I've sort of become much more aware of this year is about being an ally. It says, how can I, as a white middle class able-bodied classical performer, do more on all of these issues? So has anyone got any thoughts about positive action? What can we be doing now? We're all individuals, but together, I think we can maybe we can do more. I mean, I would certainly say get more involved with the ISM, because they are doing brilliant campaigning on all of these issues, and certainly about helping the excluded freelancers who've fallen through more government nets as well. But what do you think we can be doing, Mark? If I start with you, just very quickly in the last.
Yeah, there's two things that I think are worth thinking about. One's more negative and one's more positive. If you are a person that people take seriously, for example, you look and sound like a lot of people in the industry, then you can draw attention to bad behavior. Like people might be more willing to do things like make transphobic jokes around you, and you can draw attention to this and flag that you think it's unacceptable and it shouldn't happen. If like a lot of the high profile examples of like really bad practice and like bullying and abuse in creative industries in the last few months have often been from people who conform to this kind of stereotype, and the people around them not necessarily doing anything about it. So if people take you seriously, then drawing attention to bad behavior is a really positive thing that you can do. The other thing that you can do is, and again, I'll just refer to one specific example, but there's loads of things like this. You can volunteer as a mentor for Arts Emergency. You can work with young people from backgrounds that aren't like yours to engage with them directly on supporting getting into and staying in the industry. So there's just two examples of, I think, fairly straightforward. I mean, like it'll take time. It's not sort of an overnight thing again, but these are things that you can do personally that will help individuals and organizations.
Brilliant. Thank you. Mahaliah, what are your thoughts? What can we do? Positive actions, be better allies.
Well, I looked up once the definition of allyship, and it was something like a lifelong process of building relationships, trust, consistency, accountability. And the two things that stick out to me are accountability and lifelong. So, you know, being an ally, it's not just for the rest of this year saying, oh yes, I'm going to post about a Black performer, or I'm going to work with somebody one time to make sure I draw attention to them. But it's that consistent kind of learning and that consistent search for knowledge and aware and actions that can be done to not just to appear to be somebody who is not racist or appear to be somebody who is accepting, but actually actioning that. So an action can be to connect with a musician who you think is really great, or somebody who hasn't had much traction. You respect their art, you respect their creativity, and you know, pull them into your circle. That might be performing. You know, at the moment we can't do much performing in person, but that might be a Zoom rehearsal, that might be a jam session, that might be just bringing them, taking them enduring as a mentor, or even the opposite way around, seeing what you can learn from them. I think that's cultural exchange is really important. As a teacher, I'm always thinking, okay, what can I learn from my students? And I think we can do that together as adults, thinking, okay, I'm a white male. Well, a lot of what we do, a lot of the output is white male centric. So think about it in the opposite direction. What can I learn from the other person? And it requires honesty with yourself. It requires you to be honest, and that is hard. That is it's difficult to kind of look into yourself and think, okay, what can I learn? Because, you know, if you're a successful musician, or you've got, you know, whatever your definition of success is, you might think, well, I've done everything. But I think, yeah, pulling other different people into your circle, seeing how you can support with your actions through maybe outreach, maybe through mentoring, maybe through you know, supporting different charities with, you know, whatever you have that is a strength in this industry, how can you put it to good use that is sustained and lifelong, and builds a sense of community that changes things for the better. There are lots of things we can do, but I think one starting point is to broaden your circle and bring other people in, because something that I've experienced is that you kind of don't know what you don't know. And until I went to the Purcell School, I didn't know about certain things, and I wouldn't have known about them had I not gone to a specialist music school that pays, you know, that charges £32,000 a year. So, you know, people cannot possibly be, you know, aware of things or kind of upgrade if you don't broaden your circle. And I think that's somewhere that you can start now.
And I think for musicians, I mean, surely it must have a positive effect on your creativity as well. You know, if you're just sort of confining yourself to one little circle over here, it's you know, when you've got this whole world. I think for me, the best music always comes out of these cross-cultural collaborations. But so Keith, what do you think about, you know, what can we do positively?
I think both Mark and Mahaliah hit the nail right on the head. I mean, both of them from slightly different points of view. First of all, Mark hit the nail right on the head because from the point of view of the question, the first thing you have to do is you have to be active and not passive. So in other words, just mentally thinking to yourself, you know, I don't agree with that, or, you know, I'm not really happy with the way that this conversation is going, is a very different thing from actually actively challenging it, and challenging it from a background where the people making the comments or behaving in a certain way think, well, hang on a minute, this person's like me and they are challenging me on what I'm saying. I have to take this seriously. I think that's a very, very important thing. I think the other thing, the point that Mahaliah made, which is you have to get out there, right? It's no good. In employment terms, one of the things that people have always said in the music industry is, well, we'd like to employ more Black people or more people from ethnic minorities, but we don't know where to find them. Because you don't go and look. You know, actually get yourself out there and find out what's going on, and be prepared to have mentoring both up and down. So in other words, be prepared to learn from people that you meet. Don't always think that you are teaching people things. So I think both of those 2 points are really important.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And Mary Alice, what are your thoughts about, you know, what can we be doing as individuals? How can we make this better?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mahaliah put it beautifully in terms of the importance of broadening your circle, broadening your breadth of perspective through connecting with people who are not like you, who can help you understand how the world looks like from their side. And you know, Keith's just said it in a beautiful way too. You know, you put yourself in a position of a learner always in life. You can learn from other people. You are not the giver of truth. You need to understand how the world has been experienced by other people in order to really understand what inclusion means, and strive for change and improvement. I mean, I endorse everything that all the other panelists have said. You know, if I was to try and kind of boil it down to something pithy to end with, I think it's educate yourself. So being knowledgeable and having an informed perspective allows you to advocate for change in a powerful way. Ensuring that you challenge within your own organisations, and you demand, well, you try and lead change through improved representation of all types of people. I think that's a responsibility we all have, is to challenge the norms that we live with, and also providing more access and choice for people. Jo Thomas, who we work with on the Take It Away consortium and who was involved with the Reshape Music report, there's a quote from her introduction, which is, "Choice is a catalyst for creativity." And I absolutely agree with that. If you give people the choices in life that give them the greatest opportunity to be creative, that in itself will drive change. And yeah, I hope that's something we'll see more of in the future.
And I hope also to, you know, sort of put it back into the prism of COVID-19 this year, as you were saying earlier, Mary Alice. You know, I really do hope that we've all collectively learned some very humbling experiences, I think, and I often think about, you know, sometimes out of total disaster, things can be, you know, we do learn lessons as humans. Sometimes we do learn lessons, and hopefully we will be able to rebuild back better. I love that phrase as well, and hopefully, you know, the good work that you're all involved with will have a lasting impact, so that when we look at the research and the statistics ongoing in the coming years, that we see more inclusion in our workplaces in the music industry than has happened in previous decades. I really hope that we can. So thank you very, very much. What an interesting discussion. I'm sorry if we've not managed to get to everybody's questions, but hopefully, you know, it was just a brief overview of conversations that I think we could be talking about for the rest of the afternoon. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time. I've been asked to mention right at the end now, just to say that coming up, that you've got two choices now as attendees of the ISM Empowered Musician Conference. You can either stay tuned here. This is the main channel. We're going to have an exclusive lunchtime performance and a tech masterclass from beatboxer, producer, and live looper SK Shlomo. So that's coming up in 1 minute. Or if you would like to find out more about the ISM and how they can support you in your music career, you can join a Zoom session with a member of the ISM team by clicking on the yellow button at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. So I think that's all from me and the amazing panel this afternoon. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Much.